So dear friends and viewers, I want to welcome you to this special podcast that we're filming here in the European Parliament in Brussels. The occasion is an event we held this morning on the Digital Service Act, but we're talking more broadly about fundamental freedoms of speech here in Europe and broader. So I want to welcome Rod Dreher, a special guest, and also Paul Coleman from ADF, who are with me today. So Rod, I wanted to begin with your book, Live Not by Lies. I was very impressed with the underlying message, and I do believe it's relevant for Europe today, this experience of the dissidents under communism, and congratulations on the film as well. Could you maybe elaborate for our audience why this experience under totalitarianism is so relevant for us today?
Sure. Back in 2015, at the start of what we in America call the Great Awakening, I started to hear from people who had come to America from the Soviet bloc to escape communism. And they were starting to tell me what they see emerging in America today with cancel culture, things like that, reminded them of what they left behind. Now, I thought that was an extreme judgment, but the more I listened to them, the more I realized these people, because of their experience under totalitarianism, saw things that the rest of us could not see. So what I ended up doing was writing a book about the similarities between hard totalitarianism of the Soviet brand and the softer version that is emerging today. And then I traveled to the former countries of the Soviet bloc to talk to dissidents who stayed behind, some of who went to prison for their beliefs. The overwhelming message I got from them is that if you think totalitarianism is only about gulags and KGB colonels, you're wrong. It's happening now, but it's coming out in a much softer, more therapeutic way, and we had better wake up. I think that members of the European Parliament who come from the former communist countries are uniquely prepared to make this argument and to make that stand.
Yes. I agree with that, coming from Croatia, and I also took note of your emphasis on the importance of suffering and the willingness to suffer for the truth. Do you see this willingness in Western society today?
No, and that is one reason we are in as much trouble as we're in. Everywhere I went in the former communist countries, talking to every dissident, it all comes back to the same thing. You have got to be willing to say the truth and to pay a price for saying the truth, a real price. For them, it meant going to prison. For other people in our societies, it could mean the hatred of your colleagues. You could lose your job, your business could be attacked, and so on and so forth. But if we're not willing to do that, then we've lost.
We've lost.
You know, Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident,
Yes,
and the first president of a free Czechoslovakia, he said that we can live in truth if we are prepared to suffer for it. And the few people who are willing to take that initial risk and make a stand, they will be an example to the rest of people. I must add, though, that one of the great Czech dissidents who's still alive today, Kamila Bendova, she told me, she and her late husband, Václav Benda, were Catholics. And they had to make common cause with liberals, Havel and the other liberals. But she said it was easy to do because when you're facing totalitarianism, the one quality you have to look for in allies is courage. Havel had it, and the other hippies, the liberals, had it, while their fellow Catholics, many of them did not. I think this is a good reason why we, who may be on the political right, we can find people on the left who value free speech and who are willing to stand with us to fight for it.
Yes, yes. And thank you for dedicating this book to a fine Croatian priest, Pog Lion, who I had the privilege to meet in my younger years. So thank you for that.
You know why he's so important, Pog Lion? He escaped the Nazis from Zagreb and went to Slovakia, lived under the name Father Tomislav Kolakovic, and he warned the Slovak church, prepare yourself. The Germans are going to lose this war. That's great. But the Soviets are going to be ruling this country, and the first thing they're going to do is persecute the church. Many bishops and others in
Yes.
society didn't believe him. They thought he was being alarmist, but he knew what was coming, and he set about methodically to prepare the underground church for persecution. Thank God he made his witness, and thank God young people there were willing to listen to him.
Yes.
And start building the resistance. This is clearly relevant for Europe today, and frankly for my country, the United States today.
I agree. What a heroic witness, and also someone who really was ahead of the curve, prophetic, and saw what was coming. So, Paul, on behalf of ADF, you're following closely what's happening with speech, with potential for abuse with the Digital Service Act. We called it the Digital Surveillance Act this morning, which I think is actually quite accurate. We don't have to speculate much about the abuse of this legislation. It's already happening. How do you see now the current state of affairs? We see pressure being put on tech companies. The founder and owner of Telegram has stated that he's been pressured by the French authorities regarding the recent election in Romania. How has this become tolerated in mainstream Europe today?
I think over the last 10, 15 years, a framework has been laid for censorship across Europe and around the Western world. And it really, I think, targets three things. Firstly, governments are seeking to censor speakers directly. And so that might be through the use of criminal law and that sort of thing. We've seen that in cases that we work on at ADF, for example, Päivi Räsänen in Finland.
Yes.
Now, that's one way of doing it. The other is to censor speakers through the platforms that they're speaking on. And so what we see is infrastructure laid to essentially regulate people's speech through the platforms themselves. And so it's not necessarily the state, or in this case, the EU doing it directly. It's sort of outsourced to the web of private actors that host all of this speech on the internet. And then if that doesn't happen, then these platforms are threatened with being shut down if they don't comply. So a combination of these different means or methodologies creates a huge censorship web that has been laid through criminal law, through regulation of private platforms, through speech codes on these platforms. And it's very alarming because if we trace back where we are today and go back, say, 10, 15 years, and we see the development over time, if that trajectory continues at anything like the pace that we have seen in this time, then in another 10, 15 years or less, it's not an exaggeration to say that the sort of stories that Rod talks about and writes about in Live Not by Lies, we will see ourselves come full circle and be living through that again.
So the letter of the former commissioner Thierry Breton to Elon Musk regarding this conversation he was having with then presidential candidate Trump was quite a shock for many people, but seems in this city of Brussels not particularly controversial. Could you comment on how open they are in threatening big tech companies that are essentially the public square today?
I think it was a warning to the world of what could happen, because you have a conversation taking place between two Americans on an American platform with a very senior figure within the European Union warning them and threatening them to comply with the DSA, with European law. And I think that was the first moment that people realized, oh, there's something big going on here. Two of the most powerful people in the world are being warned about what they can and can't say on an American platform.
But even before the conversation took place, they were warned.
Yeah, before it took place, they were warned not to breach the Digital Services Act. So, and that goes to one of the ways that the EU and other Western nations are looking to censor, which is if they can't control speech on the platforms through the deals that they make with the tech companies that we don't have access to, through the speech codes that these companies adopt, through the algorithms and so forth, the shadow banning. If they can't do it that way, and the company itself says, well, we're going to allow this to happen, then we see a sort of escalation. They threaten the platform itself. We saw that in Brazil with X. We saw the threats made against X here in Europe. We saw it against Telegram. And I think we will continue to see this sort of thing.
So they don't really believe in free speech. It's more controlled or regulated speech that they are imposing or defending.
Yeah, the narrative that has been adopted in the last decade is that free speech actually is a little bit dangerous. Free speech can be weaponized. Free speech is dangerous for democracy. And so they've convinced themselves that we save democracy through censorship, which is an incredible thing to convince themselves of.
Yes.
And so what that means is, yeah, we can have free speech, but within this nice, neat, tidy limits that they define.
And they obviously do not have confidence in the judgment of ordinary people to reach conclusions on their own.
The right conclusions.
The right conclusions.
Yeah, we talked about it this morning, but I think the pivotal year came in 2016 when either side of the Atlantic you had the Brexit vote and the Trump vote.
Yes.
And these two things happening at the same time created this shock to the system.
Yes.
And rather than taking a moment of self-reflection and thinking, well, maybe we need to understand the electorate a bit better, they took the approach that the electorate has been tricked, they have been misled, they're fools, they're ignorant, and we need to sanitize the news for them. We need to control the information flow for them so that bad outcomes like Brexit and Trump don't happen again.
Yeah.
And then we've seen that play out across European countries. We've seen the sort of meddling in Germany, in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, in France, and it's becoming more and more brazen.
It's becoming brazen, and I don't understand why ordinary Europeans put up with it anymore. I think they need to wake up. In the United States, COVID was a big wake-up call for how the government tried to manipulate by threatening social media companies, how the expert class in medical science and so forth, how they flat out lied. You know, I remember that summer of 2020, we were all told, stay in your house, don't go to church, don't go out. But if you want to go out and protest against racism, it's fine. You won't get sick. This is an important thing because it causes the ordinary people to lose faith in authority. And so the more that Europe, that this city, Brussels, tries to regulate speech to prevent people from saying what they see with their actual eyes, actually the less authority they will have over the people.
I agree with that. That's clearly COVID. There's so many examples of abuse of power and overreach and contradictions. The reality is they were telling people not to bury their grandfathers and grandmothers, not go to church, but at the same time, if the cause was right, they were condoned to mass protest and so on. So it's really the elites and the scientific community also were compromised in a way I don't think they can recover really, that trust of the common person.
Right. And it is across fields, right? And I think, Stephen, that the thing that we have to remember is that these people in democracies, they get their authority by the consent of the government. But that's not what it feels like here in Brussels, at the European Parliament, with the European Commission. They want everyone to shut up, keep funding them, and accept what they're told. It can't last forever. This is one of the insights that both Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Václav Havel had, that a system built on lies and manipulating the truth and forbidding people from saying what they really think and what they really see, it's going to fall apart eventually.
I agree with you. I think the private conversations people are having and what they're saying in public, there's a huge gap, and that's not a healthy situation. It's not a healthy situation. Rod, you're a personal friend of Vice President Vance. I was very happy with his recent speech at the Munich Security Conference. Many weren't, but I think this kind of frank, open talk was necessary. But the reaction was very hostile. Many European elites believe that he's anti-European, which is nonsense, I would say. He actually cares about Western civilization, is willing to speak these hard truths. What is your reaction to this whole episode from last February? This was, made huge headlines and was, obviously followed up by all kinds of negative remarks by people in Europe, the political class. But I think the ordinary citizen who was paying attention was pleased and grateful to hear these remarks. How did you see this?
Yeah, right after the vice president delivered those remarks, my phone lit up with friends, conservative friends from all the way from London to Bucharest saying, yes, finally somebody said what we think.
Yes.
But it had to be an American to do it.
Yes.
I think it is nonsense to think that J.D. Vance hates Europe. I can tell you, he loves Europe. I've been to Europe with him, and he loves Europe as the source of our patrimony of Western civilization. But he loves Europe enough to tell its leadership class the truth. And the truth is, your biggest security problems are not Russia, though it's a problem, but it's the internal problems with migration and insecurity and social instability that the ruling class, both here in Brussels and in various national capitals, prefer not to talk about it. Rather, they prefer to suppress the speech about it. They want people not to see what they see with their own eyes.
Yes.
And I think JD did Europe a favor by calling them out like that.
Yes. I think serving here since last July, it may be even worse than he thinks. I take part in committee meetings on a regular basis. You have animal rights activists who actually pay more attention to the rights, so-called rights of animals than they do of human beings. So the reality is that many here are following an ideology to its extreme end, and it's obviously not in the interest of everyday people. They're replacing defending the interest of citizens, not to mention unborn children, and the new focus is on, the welfare of animals. We have a commissioner in the European Commission at the highest level now. The portfolio is called Health and Animal Welfare. So they've actually officially at the highest level put animals on the same moral plane, you could say, as human beings.
Look, ultimately this will hurt the ruling class and its structures. I'll give you an example. 2024, the Munich Security Conference came. Senator J.D. Vance, a first-term senator, went there to share his views on Ukraine. He was against NATO's policy with Ukraine. Nobody would talk to him. He texted me, I live in Budapest, to say, hey, friend, you want to come have dinner with me? Nobody here will talk to me. It wasn't that they disagreed with him, though they did. It was that they didn't even want to hear from him. So he and I went to dinner, and then I have a picture that I put on social media of the two of us enjoying beer and sausage there in Munich on Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, it is Ohio State.
Ohio State shirt, just a rube American who none of the elites in Munich have to pay attention to. 1 year later, he returns as the American vice president, and they had to sit in the chair and listen to him.
Well, he's too big to cancel now. Right. He's too big.
But think about how shocked they were.
Yes.
Because they didn't think that his position was even worth listening to, even though he, as a senator, being skeptical of NATO policy to Ukraine, he represented a significant number of Americans.
Yes.
But these elites, they don't even want to hear it. And the same thing happens in any number of fields in the United States.
Yes, yes. But it's really a telling anecdote. As a political philosopher, I would teach my students about various theories of government. There's some who still argue that truth has a place in the public square, but today I would say there's so much distortion and manipulation that people are simply lost and cannot even discern what is true and isn't. And we have so much media abuse and manipulation in this regard. They're actually trying to create a new reality instead of informing in a responsible way citizens. We live in this new age of social media. I'm in politics. I know how important this is. In America, I think the influence of mainstream media has declined sharply, and in many ways, Trump has unmasked the bias, and they will never regain the same power to move opinion as they had before. What is the situation in Europe today, would you say? Is there hope that there will be enough new media, podcasts and so on, to replace the old media landscape, or are we still far behind America? How would you describe the situation?
US came first, UK followed behind, continental Europe is lagging behind but catching up. And I think part of what we're talking about here with the Digital Services Act is a recognition that the ruling elites have paid attention to the fact that it's not enough now to just control the mainstream media as they have been doing for years. They fund the mainstream media, all of their stories get placed, it's one big setup. With the rise of alternative media platforms, and particularly the rise of social media platforms where you can cut through and bypass essentially the gatekeepers of information,
yes,
and talk directly to people. I think that the European elites here at the European Union and elsewhere across different Western nations are desperately seeking to rein that in. And so that is essentially the battleground. Will we be able to hold on to these alternative news platforms, alternative voices, social media platforms, or will they try and rein all of these different voices in so that we get our nice, clean, sanitized news that's already been pre-filtered for us?
Yes.
And I think in terms of what you're saying, no one knows what's true anymore. I think that is true, and that's obviously a great challenge. There is a lot of noise, and it's exhausting to try and cut through all of that noise and get to the bottom of what's actually happening. So I think that is a reality, but we're faced with a choice. We either accept that that's what it takes to navigate all of the different voices, the different noise, or we say, well, that's too much hard work, that's too much trouble. There might be wrong news mixed in there, there might be wrong opinions mixed in there, so we're gonna cede our decision-making and our analysis to those in power, and they can become the arbiters of truth for us. They can decide what's right and wrong for us, and they can present to us, yes, this sort of pre-cleared, filtered news. And my opinion is that is obviously far more dangerous, far more damaging than us as citizens doing the hard work of wading through the noise ourselves to figure out what's going on.
Yes.
And that's a part that we have to take, that responsibility we have to take on. I recently read an oral history of Russia in the immediate post-Soviet years. And there was a quote in there from some ordinary Russian who missed communism. He said, "I used to love it when you could pick up Pravda and know what to think." And he wasn't being ironic. He really meant that because freedom made him anxious, and he preferred the simple lies, yes, that allowed him to feel calm to the complicated truth. Yes. Well, the same choice is facing us now.
Yes.
And that's why this new totalitarianism, the softer totalitarianism, is a therapeutic totalitarianism that depends on people wanting decisions to be made for them so they don't have to be anxious about it. Well, Solzhenitsyn said that if we, talking to his own people, if we're that sort of person, then we don't deserve liberty.
Right. This experience under hard totalitarianism, this brings me to maybe the final point in our podcast today. Pope John Paul II was an effective leader at the time, and eventually, I think it's not an exaggeration to say, without his leadership, communism would not have collapsed in Eastern Europe. But he was aware of the internal weakness of these regimes, that they relied so much on force and terror to maintain power. And he knew deeply, and he experienced this, that at the end of the day, it would just take a little more courage from ordinary people to start bringing it down. And I think this process began after his first visit to Poland as Pope in 1979. You mentioned courage earlier, and this virtue that's lacking in many ways in politics, in the public square. People prefer to be opportunistic, calculate, not expose themselves too much. Perhaps Central and Eastern Europe has a lesson to teach the rest of the world. In many ways here at the European Parliament, I see more strength in colleagues coming from these countries who endured so much suffering and have much to teach, but the Western elites still prefer to pontificate and to speak down to them. Perhaps you could comment on this.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's a special opportunity and a special responsibility from MEPs from the former communist bloc to say what they see and to talk about where this hatred of freedom ultimately goes. But you also face, Stephen, a real challenge here. I remember talking to a Slovak Catholic priest when I started my research for the book. He said in some ways it was easier under communism because the gospel shone a clear light through the darkness.
Yes.
Now when the gospel shines out into it, it hits only fog. I think part of that is because we don't have the mechanisms, at least not yet, of heavy state repression. And so we're free. But within that, we're free, or at least we have the illusion of freedom. But within this consumerist capitalist culture, people manufacture our consent. They tell us, like, you can say what you want, but you just might not be able to keep your job, or if people boycott your business, too bad for you. And we have so little care for courage and admiration for courage, so much fear of discomfort that we prefer to keep our heads down rather than stand up for the truth.
Yes, I agree with that. Paul, you're based in Vienna. Austria is an interesting case. We have a parliamentary democracy where you can win an election, actually be the leading party, and not get into power. Something's broken, obviously, in Europe. Is this tenable? Can this continue in such a way?
I was with Rod last night, and we both agree that something is going to give. We won't just go year on year in this extraordinary situation, but none of us know, I think, what that means or what's going to happen. And there's a spectrum of views in terms of how bad people think things will get. But I think it's abundantly clear that in terms of what you were saying about those who hold on to power using increasing force in order to do so. We see that in almost every Western European country at this point. And eventually that is going to break. Something is going to break. I saw it in the UK last summer, where we had these riots in the Southport, and the government response to people speaking out, people voicing their opinions was utterly remarkable. The amount of police resources that went into policing tweets was incredible. Yeah. And it goes to what you're saying, that there's a recognition of just how vulnerable their position is. That, as Rod said, it requires the consent of the governed. Yes. They do not have that consent, and therefore they're turning increasingly to force to hold on to it. Yes. So they won't be able to hold on forever.
I agree. Well, this has been delightful for me to host you both. It's not every day that we have such a, I would say, stimulating conversation on these fundamental points. And the European Parliament is, I think, the appropriate place to have these discussions. So thanks again for joining this podcast. Hopefully it'll go viral and be shared by millions around the world. Thank you for joining us, and that's all for now here in Brussels.